Okay, got the manifold just below me here. There's a power point, an outdoor power point just here, and this is our controller unit. Now you can get these in an indoor version or an outdoor version. In my case I'm doing it outside. Behind me is the kitchen, so I don't really want to put the unit inside, but if for example you had the tap and the manifold were around beside the garage, you could push a hole through the wall, put your cables and that through the wall and have it inside. So it'd probably be easier too, because you can pick up an indoor power point there. In this case I've got an outdoor power point. Obviously you need a power point within the length of the lead, and now I need to mount that up and I can start wiring everything up into that. So obviously when you first start to look at where your system's going to go, have a think about how you're going to power it, where the nearest power point is, whether you want it inside or outside, and you can work from there. And also you can get, there's not a real big issue if your solenoids are a distance away from your controller. You can run wires quite a long way, so I wouldn't be too worried about having it. Obviously this has got to be close enough to the power point, but the cables from your controller can run quite a long distance, so that shouldn't be a major factor if you have to cable it a ways away from where the solenoids are. Okay, I've got the controller connected up here. I'm now going to make sense of all the wires and connect those wires up into each of the different zones in the controller. Now it looks like a tangled mess, but it is quite simple when you come down to it. You do need some cables to make your way from here to your controller. As I said, this is quite a short run. They can be quite long runs if you can't get your controller close to your solenoids. The distance is not a problem with this sort of cabling, but in my case it's quite close. I will run some conduit up the wall just to make it a bit neater, but at the moment I need to connect the right wires to put it back into the controller and make sure it's all waterproof, and then connect it into the controller. Now if you look at each controller, each solenoid valve I should say, there's two wires coming out of each one. There's two there, and so on. Now it doesn't matter which one you use. One's got to connect into the zone inside the terminal box inside the controller, which we'll show you, and the other one's what we call a common. You have to connect all the commons together and then produce one wire from that up into the common in here. So you pick one wire from each of the solenoids, doesn't matter which one. In this case I'll use those four. Like I said, doesn't matter. What I need to do is connect them all together and then run a single wire off the top of that and connect it into the common point in the terminal box. So that's the first thing I'll do. What I do need to use is some connectors. Now the secret is with connectors, this is, even though this might be waterproof, your box is not going to be waterproof and you don't want to get any water into this. So we're using these special little connectors. Now you can't see it from there, but they're full of gel. They've got a sort of silicone gel inside them, and when you push that inside there and clamp it up, the gel will keep it waterproof. The other thing you don't need to do, which is quite neat with this wire, you don't need to crimp off, even though these have got the wires trimmed off, you don't actually need to do that with these. They'll cut their way through the insulation and connect to the copper underneath that, which is quite a neat little thing too. So what we're going to do is connect these into this one side of this, and then the common out of it, and then we'll connect off all the other ones as well and run the cables up to the zones. Put those two together. As I said, you don't need it, but these are already been cut off, so I'll just put those two together, and then I'll pick two from the other two solenoid valves as well. Looks like a bit of a mess of wires here, but we will get there. I'll put these here, and then what I need to do from the other side of that, so they're all connected together, is then to run my common. Now I've used black because it is the typically, just because it makes it easier to pick from the other colours, but I put a black cable in there, and they should all go nicely together. And then all I need to do is crimp this down nice and hard, like so. Whoop, it's just come out. Silicone's inside there, and then I just crimp it in really nice and tight. And yeah, there's your joint all wood. So there's the 4 solenoid valves going in, and there's the common coming out that will connect to the common point on the controller. That's the first thing. The next thing to do is to connect an individual wire from each zone and then individual wire up into each of the zones. So that's the next thing we'll do. We've got the four commons connected together. Now we have to connect each one of the valves itself to a separate wire and wire it into the four zones within the controller box, which we'll show you in a minute. So I've got four separate wires. They're all red in this case because that's the cable I had available. What it's worth always keeping in mind is that when you go through this whole process, you're making sure you know, in some ways labelling what each of your solenoid valves are going to where, because after a while you get confused because everything's buried now. If you want to have them in a specific order of 1, 2, 3, 4 when you program it in here, it's worth just keeping an eye on which solenoids are which, and then also marking your cables when you wire it up in so you can make sure you connect the right solenoid to the right zone if that's important to you. So it's the same thing. In this case I've got four of the connectors, the same connectors, and I just need to push those into inside the connectors for each one and then take them up to the valve. So I'll just put those in and do the same thing, and I'll do this 4 times. Okay, I'm going to run all the cables through conduit so it's nice and neat and up against the wall because you don't want loose cables lying around everywhere. This is where this tool is also great because you can also use it to cut conduit, so it's a very handy. So that means I can put that up through there and connect all my cables through there, and then I'll use some masonry nails or masonry screws to put a saddle up against that so it's nice and neat up against the wall, and then all my cables will pass up through that. I've connected all the wiring up and wired it up through some conduit into the box, the bottom of the box. I've labelled all these 1, 2, 3, 4 for the 4 solenoid valves on this particular one. This one's another sensor I'm using. I've decided to put in a soil moisture sensor. That's a very much an optional thing, but I've included one in this particular setup. And also here I've put in the flow meter that I've put as well, so I can wire the 2 sensors in as well as the 4 solenoid valves. So all that cabling is now up here ready to be terminated on the terminals within the unit itself. I'm just going to strip the ends of the cables. I've just got some side cutters. You can get a tool that'll do this for you, but I just do it. Just make sure all the cables have got some trim off it so I can now cable them in. This is where it's really important that you've labelled everything, because once it gets to here, there's no way of knowing which cable's which unless you've colour coded them or labelled them. So it's very important. Seems like a nice thing to do, but once you get to here and you start looking at all these cables, you want to make sure you know which one's going where. So now we've got to cable them into the right particular terminals. Okay, the first one I'm going to do is the common. This is the one that I connected to all 4 valves. And you might not be able to see the writing, but it says common at the bottom. Then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible zones. We're only needing 4, but this particular Hydrawise unit can handle up to 6. So I'll just undo the screw and then put the cable into the common. Make sure it goes in nice and tight. That's in tight. Now this is where I've got to find the right ones. Now I've labelled these with a little marker pen on each of them, so I know which zone is which. So that's zone 1. I'll just trim that off a little bit. Put that into the one that's quite clearly marked. You can't see it there with the unit. It's quite clearly marked 1, 2, 3 through to 6. That's number 1. Like I said, this is where it's really handy having labelled all these. So this is number 2. I'll put that into number 2. I didn't do it in this case because I have no intention of increasing the number of zones, but you might want to run through spare core cables through, just in case down the track you've got plans to expand it. It doesn't hurt to run some cables through the conduit and have them sitting here as spares. I haven't done that in this particular case, That's not a bad thing to think about, because you've got 2 extra spare cores here. Obviously down the track I could just run another piece of conduit, but that's another thing to think about, just for some possibility of expansion later. So there are the zones all in, and the only ones I've got to put in now are the sensors, and they go up in this part of the terminal. There's terminals or outlets for 2 possible sensors, which I've got a soil tester there and a flow meter here, and I'll do those next. Everything's now wired up. I've got the 4 zones in here, the common, which came from each of the 4 solenoids, and our 2 sensors up here, also with a common for the 2 sensors. So now it's all wired up. The next stage of the process is to program the Hunter device so I can start testing it out.
If this video was helpful, you can get a lot more information on our website, completelandscapes.co.nz, or check out other videos on our YouTube channel.